In the modern world, food is a given. You walk into a store, and there it is. Shelves lined with bread, fruits from halfway across the planet, meats, dairy, and an endless array of neatly packaged goods. Refrigerators hum quietly in our kitchens, preserving leftovers for days, even weeks. If something goes bad, it's often a mild inconvenience rather than a disaster. But step back in time, thousands of years into the ancient world, and food was no longer a certainty. It was a daily gamble. For the people of ancient times, growing food wasn't just a skill or a profession, it was a desperate negotiation with nature itself. The very act of planting a seed was a wager. Every harvest depended on a precarious balance of factors entirely outside human control. If the rain fell too little or too much, if the temperature swayed unexpectedly, if the insects descended or the winds blew the wrong way, months of hard labor could vanish overnight. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your family's survival depended on forces you could neither see nor influence. The farmer's life in ancient times was a life lived in constant uncertainty. While kings ruled from their palaces, and priests offered rituals to the gods, the common farmer rose with the sun to face the soil, the sky, and an endless string of invisible threats. Even the simple act of clearing a field was an ordeal. Before the invention of modern plows or machines, farmers relied on crude wooden tools, often dragged by hand or, if fortunate, by animals. Clearing rocks, breaking up tough soil, and removing stubborn roots required backbreaking labor that could span days or even weeks. And even after the ground was prepared, the uncertainty only began. The seeds they planted were often saved from previous harvests. There were no commercial seed companies, no genetic modifications to ensure higher yields. If last year's crop had been poor, the seeds might be weak. And if disease had affected the plants, those diseases could carry on through the seeds themselves. In many cases, families had to choose between eating their limited supply of grain or saving enough to plant for the next year. The wrong decision could mean starvation. Once the seeds were in the ground, nature took full control. Farmers prayed for the right amount of rain. Too little rain led to drought. The soil dried up, cracks splitting the earth open like wounds. Crops withered in the fields, leaves turning brown and curling under the relentless sun. Too much rain, on the other hand, could wash away seeds before they even took root or flood entire fields, rotting young plants before they had a chance to grow. And rain wasn't the only concern. Storms could bring hail, shredding fragile plants in moments. Winds could flatten entire fields, breaking stalks beyond repair. Sudden frosts, even late into spring or early in autumn, could kill plants overnight. Every season carried its own set of threats, and farmers lived with constant anxiety, watching the sky with wary eyes. Even if the weather cooperated, animals posed another danger. Herds of wild animals, deer, boar, birds, and rodents, could descend upon a field and devour entire crops. Insects were another constant menace. Locusts, in particular, were feared across many regions. A single swarm could strip a landscape bare in hours, leaving behind nothing but devastation. Diseases also threatened both crops and the farmers themselves. Fungal blights, molds, and bacteria could turn healthy plants into rotting masses almost overnight. For the farmers who depended on monoculture, growing a single crop like wheat, barley, or rice, disease could wipe out everything in one cruel sweep. Behind all of these immediate dangers loomed a much larger, more terrifying specter: famine. If a harvest failed, the consequences weren't just bad, they were often catastrophic. Families would first eat their stored reserves, then their seed grain. After that came their livestock, if they had any. Eventually, hunger would set in, and with it came malnutrition, disease, and often death. Entire communities could vanish after just 1 or 2 years of failed harvests. In many ancient societies, food shortages also led to violence. Desperate communities raided neighbors, stole livestock, and fought for control of scarce resources. Wars and migrations often had their roots in failed harvests and widespread hunger. The inability to produce enough food was not just a personal crisis, it could destabilize entire regions and topple kingdoms. The farmers' gamble didn't end with the harvest. Once crops were gathered, they had to be dried, threshed, and stored. Grain stored improperly could rot, mold, or attract insects and rodents. A single spoiled storage container could ruin months of work. And because storage methods were primitive, clay jars, wooden bins, or underground pits, the risk of spoilage was ever present. Despite all these risks, farming was still essential. Without it, no one could eat. And so, generation after generation of farmers faced the same grueling uncertainty, working tirelessly in fields under the open sky, praying that nature would favor them, if only for one more season. Religion and superstition often played a large role in this struggle. Many ancient cultures developed elaborate rituals, offerings, and festivals designed to appease gods of rain, fertility, and harvest. Temples were built, sacrifices made, and prayers offered in hopes of influencing the forces beyond human control. A good harvest was seen as divine favor, a bad one as punishment or ill omen. The social structure of ancient communities often reflected the importance of farming. Farmers held a vital role, though rarely a prestigious one. They bore the heaviest burdens of labor, but their success, or failure, affected everyone, from peasants to kings. In many places, rulers collected a portion of the harvest as tax or tribute, placing even greater pressure on farmers to produce enough, not just for themselves, but for their overlords as well. Over time, some societies developed irrigation systems, crop rotation, and rudimentary fertilizers to improve yields. But even with these innovations, farming remained fundamentally uncertain. Every seed planted was a tiny act of faith, a silent hope that nature would smile kindly upon the fragile sprouts breaking through the soil. Today, with our supermarkets and global food networks, it's easy to forget just how precarious life once was. But for the farmers of ancient times, every meal was a reminder of their never-ending struggle. They lived and died by the whims of nature, a reality that shaped not only their daily lives, but the very course of human history. In the ancient world, weather was not simply something to talk about when there was nothing else to say. It was the great power that ruled over daily life, deciding whether people would feast or starve. The farmer's entire existence revolved around the unpredictable moods of the sky. And unlike today, there were no forecasts, no satellites, and no warning systems. The only predictions came from the wisdom of the old, the reading of signs in the clouds, or the flights of birds. But even these were little more than hopeful guesses. Imagine standing in your tiny field, looking up at the sky, scanning for dark clouds or feeling the air shift. A strong breeze from the west might bring much-needed rain, or it might bring a storm that would flatten your crops. The ancient farmer lived with this constant tension, never sure if the coming days would bring relief or disaster. Spring, for many farmers, was the season of hope and dread. It was planting time, when seeds were carefully pushed into the earth. Too much rain at this stage would wash the seeds away, or drown the delicate sprouts before they could emerge. But too little rain would leave the soil dry and unyielding, turning seeds into lifeless specks buried in dust. The timing of the rains was everything. In regions like Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers made farming possible, floods could be both a blessing and a curse. The rivers brought fertile silt that nourished the soil, but unpredictable floods could also destroy entire fields. Farmers built canals and dikes to try to control the water, but even with these efforts, a sudden rise in water levels could wash away months of preparation overnight. In Egypt, the Nile's annual flood was both celebrated and feared. When the flood came as expected, it left behind rich, dark soil perfect for growing crops. But if the flood was too low, there wouldn't be enough water to irrigate the fields, leading to poor harvests and hunger. If the flood was too high, it could sweep away villages, drown livestock, and destroy granaries. The pharaohs even employed special officials, the nilometers, to measure the flood's height, trying to predict the year's harvest, and set tax levels accordingly. Summer brought its own hazards. In many parts of the ancient world, summers were blisteringly hot and dry. Without enough rain, crops would wither under the relentless sun. Farmers watched helplessly as leaves curled and stalks drooped, knowing that once the plants reached a certain point of stress, there was no saving them. A prolonged drought meant disaster not just for one farm, but for entire regions. In places like Greece, Rome, and the Near East, droughts could trigger widespread famine and force populations to migrate in search of food. Autumn, the harvest season, was a time of both relief and anxiety. The crops were nearly ready, but still vulnerable. A sudden storm could knock grains to the ground, where they would rot or be eaten by animals. Heavy rains could prevent farmers from gathering their crops, leaving them to spoil in the fields. Even as they cut the stalks and gathered the fruits of their labor, farmers feared the possibility of early frosts that could ruin what remained. Winter, though a time of rest from planting and harvesting, brought its own worries. Cold temperatures threatened stored food supplies. Grain stored in damp conditions could mold or freeze. Snow and ice could make it difficult to care for animals or fetch water. And in colder regions, long winters could starve both people and livestock if stores ran low. Throughout the year, every change in weather carried risks. But it wasn't just the normal seasons that threatened ancient farmers. Occasionally, nature delivered far more severe surprises. Hailstorms, for example, were especially destructive. Ice pellets falling from the sky could strip leaves from trees, crush delicate plants, and leave entire fields looking as though they had been beaten flat. Because hail often accompanied violent thunderstorms, the destruction could be sudden and total, giving farmers no time to protect their crops. Winds were another menace. Strong gusts could snap the stems of growing plants, or scatter seeds before they had a chance to take root. Dust storms, common in arid regions, could bury young plants or strip away the top layer of fertile soil. Once the soil was gone, the field became useless for years, sometimes permanently. Lightning and storms could also spark fires, especially in dry regions. A field that had managed to survive months of careful tending could be reduced to ash in a single afternoon. Without modern firefighting equipment, there was little farmers could do but watch helplessly. Sometimes, even distant weather events caused suffering. In some ancient societies, changes in monsoon patterns or ocean currents altered rainfall thousands of miles away, leading to multi-year droughts or floods. In extreme cases, volcanic eruptions far across the world could send ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering what modern scientists call volcanic winters. These sudden drops in temperature and changes in rainfall patterns led to massive crop failures that no farmer could predict or prepare for. The unpredictability of weather created a constant sense of fear and vulnerability. A farmer might do everything right, choose good seeds, work the soil carefully, irrigate as best they could, only to have the sky turn against them. One year might bring plenty, the next might bring ruin. This uncertainty also shaped ancient cultures and beliefs. Many gods and goddesses were directly tied to weather and agriculture. In Mesopotamia, there was Adad, the god of storms and rain. In Greece, Demeter ruled over the harvest. In Egypt, Osiris was associated with the Nile's fertility. Festivals and sacrifices were performed to gain their favor and ward off disaster. Superstitions flourished. Some farmers believed that certain actions, rituals, or even taboos could influence the weather. A poorly timed word, a broken ritual, or an angered deity might bring misfortune to an entire village. The fear was not entirely irrational, for the consequences of failure were so devastating that people sought any control they could grasp. Even rulers and governments recognized the importance of weather. Ancient Chinese emperors were seen as having the mandate of heaven. If floods or droughts occurred, it was often interpreted as a sign that the emperor had lost divine favor. In Rome, priests watched for omens in the flight of birds and the behavior of animals, seeking signs about the coming weather and harvests. Despite these beliefs and rituals, the fundamental truth remained: weather was beyond human control. Farmers worked hard, but ultimately, they lived at the mercy of forces far larger and more mysterious than themselves. And yet, they endured. Generation after generation, people continued to plant to hope and to adapt. Some years they starved, other years they feasted. They stored food when they could, traded with neighbors, and told stories about the years when the rains were kind or cruel. Their struggle against unpredictable weather helped shape human civilization itself. It forced communities to develop irrigation systems, storage methods, trade networks, and even forms of government designed to manage the risk of hunger. But no matter how advanced their systems became, the ancient farmer always lived with one eye on the sky, hoping that the next season would be gentle. In the great gamble of ancient agriculture, weather was always the most unpredictable player. And the stakes were nothing less than life itself. Beneath every thriving field of wheat, barley, or millet lies something both ordinary and profoundly important: soil. To the ancient farmer, the soil was not just dirt underfoot. It was the fragile stage upon which the entire drama of survival played out. Every seed, every sprout, every harvest depended entirely on the quality and health of the soil. And just like the weather, soil was a partner that could be both generous and cruel. In modern times, we rarely think much about dirt. We build on it, pave over it, and plant our gardens in neat bags of store-bought compost. But for ancient farmers, the condition of their soil determined whether they would eat or starve. It was their most precious resource, though poorly understood. The knowledge of how to maintain its fertility was learned slowly, often through bitter experience. Not all soil is created equal. Some lands were blessed with rich, dark earth full of nutrients. These lucky farmers found their fields easily supported grains, vegetables, and fruits year after year. Others were cursed with thin, rocky, or sandy soils that barely supported life. In such places, every harvest was a struggle against nature's stinginess. Ancient river valleys, such as those of the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, Indus, and Yellow rivers, provided some of the world's most fertile soils. Annual floods carried silt, fine, nutrient-rich particles, across the fields, naturally replenishing the ground each year. Farmers in these regions could count on relatively reliable harvests, if the floods behaved as expected. These areas became the birthplaces of some of humanity's earliest civilizations. But even in these fortunate regions, the soil's bounty could not be taken for granted. A failure of the floods, whether too little or too much, could exhaust the fields or wash away their fertility. Outside these river valleys, things were even more precarious. In many upland regions, soil was thin and easily eroded. Hillsides could lose their topsoil in a single heavy rainstorm, sending the precious nutrients cascading downhill into streams and rivers. Once the topsoil was gone, fields might never recover. Farmers often terraced hillsides, carving flat steps into the land to slow erosion and preserve the soil. These terraces, carefully built by hand with stone and sweat, represented both human ingenuity and desperation. Even flat lands were not always ideal. In arid regions, salty soils posed another challenge. As irrigation water evaporated under the hot sun, it left behind salts that accumulated year after year. Over time, these salts poisoned the soil, turning once fertile fields into barren wastelands. This process, known as salinization, contributed to the decline of several ancient civilizations, including parts of Mesopotamia. The constant extraction of nutrients from the soil also created problems. Each harvest removed valuable minerals that plants had drawn from the earth. Without ways to replenish these nutrients, fields gradually became less productive. Ancient farmers eventually learned techniques like crop rotation, allowing fields to rest, or planting nitrogen-fixing crops to restore fertility. But such knowledge came slowly, and many communities suffered years of poor yields before discovering these solutions. Manure became one of the earliest and most widespread fertilizers. Animal droppings were gathered and spread across fields, returning some nutrients to the soil. In some regions, even human waste was used, though this carried obvious risks of disease, if not handled carefully. Composting plant waste, mixing ashes from cooking fires, and adding crushed bones were other methods used to feed the hungry soil. In places where wood was scarce, farmers sometimes burned dried animal dung for fuel, sacrificing potential fertilizer for warmth and cooking. This trade-off often worsened soil depletion over time, but survival needs dictated such difficult choices. Weeds were another constant enemy of soil health. Unwanted plants competed with crops for nutrients and water. Farmers had to laboriously pull or dig out weeds by hand. Left unchecked, invasive plants could quickly overrun a field, choking out valuable crops and further depleting the soil's strength. Soil compaction added yet another layer of difficulty. Over time, heavy use of fields, especially by hooved animals or frequent foot traffic, compressed the soil. Compacted soil holds less water and makes it harder for roots to penetrate. Farmers sometimes broke up this hardened ground with simple wooden or iron tools, though the labor was exhausting and slow. Even the pH balance of the soil mattered, though ancient farmers had no scientific understanding of such chemistry. Some plants preferred slightly acidic soils, others needed more alkaline conditions. When fields became too acidic or alkaline over years of use, yield suffered, often with no clear explanation to the farmers who depended on them. Beyond the physical properties of soil, ancient farmers also struggled with the simple availability of arable land. Good farmland was limited. As populations grew, communities expanded into less suitable areas, steeper hills, marginal plains, and swampy lowlands. These lands were harder to work and less forgiving. The fight to coax food from them demanded even more labor, ingenuity, and luck. In many cultures, land ownership itself was a privilege tightly controlled by kings, priests, or elites. Ordinary farmers often worked land they did not own, paying rents or taxes to their lords. Failure to produce enough food not only threatened their survival, but also risked punishment or loss of land access. The pressure to maintain fertile, productive soil was therefore both personal and political. Despite all these hardships, ancient farmers developed remarkable local knowledge about their soils. They knew which patches of land drained better, which slopes caught the morning sun, which fields stayed damp too long after rains. This knowledge passed down through generations, refined by careful observation and bitter mistakes. Sometimes, farmers practiced shifting cultivation, clearing a patch of land, farming it for a few years, and then moving on to allow the soil to recover. In forested regions, this was often combined with slash and burn techniques. The ashes from burned vegetation temporarily enriched the soil, but after a few seasons, fertility declined, forcing farmers to clear new plots. In regions like Mesoamerica and Southeast Asia, terrace farming became an art form. By carefully shaping hillsides into flat, steppe fields, farmers minimized erosion and controlled water flow. The sight of these terraced mountains remains one of humanity's most enduring symbols of harmony between people and the land. And yet, for all their skill and effort, farmers could never fully master the soil. It remained a living, breathing system, complex, mysterious, and vulnerable. A few years of neglect, mismanagement, or simply bad luck could turn good land barren. Recovery could take decades, if it was possible at all. Soil exhaustion has been blamed for the decline of many ancient civilizations. When Mesopotamian fields grew too salty, harvests dwindled, and cities weakened. In Central America, deforestation and soil erosion contributed to the collapse of great cities like Tikal and Copan. Even mighty Rome faced agricultural decline as Italian fields lost fertility, forcing greater dependence on imported grain from Egypt and North Africa. The soil that had once fed empires quietly turned against them. And as the earth grew poor, so too did the people who depended upon it. In the grand gamble of ancient farming, soil was perhaps the most silent and subtle opponent. Its decline came slowly, almost invisibly, but its consequences were as devastating as any war or plague. The farmer bent over his field, planting each seed with care, never knowing if the earth beneath his feet would remain kind. Even today, as we farm with modern machines and chemical fertilizers, the lesson of ancient soil remains. The land gives generously, but only for so long as we respect its limits. The ancient farmer, though living in a world far removed from ours, knew this truth deeply and painfully. In the ancient world, farming was not a job that offered quick rewards. It was a test of patience, endurance, and constant worry. Once the seeds were planted, the farmer entered a long season of waiting, a season filled with quiet labor, silent hopes, and constant fears. The wait from planting to harvest was, in many ways, the hardest part of farming. The work, of course, did not stop after planting. Each day brought new tasks to ensure that the tiny shoots had the best chance to survive. Weeds had to be removed carefully, lest they choke out the young crops. Insects, birds, and small animals saw the tender plants as easy meals, forcing farmers to guard their fields constantly. Fences of thorny branches might keep out some animals, but not all. In many regions, irrigation became a daily ritual. Channels dug by hand carried precious water, from rivers or wells to thirsty fields. If the water ran too fast, it could wash away the fragile plants. If it came too slow, the roots might dry out. The farmer had to constantly adjust the flow, always watching the soil for signs of moisture or drought. The growth of the crops was painfully slow. A farmer could only watch as the first green shoots broke through the earth, slowly reaching upward toward the sun. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. The fields changed subtly each day, but the changes were almost imperceptible, like the slow movement of stars across the sky. During this long wait, the farmer lived under a constant cloud of anxiety. Would the rains continue? Would the sun shine too hot? Would an unexpected frost come too early? The smallest shift in weather could undo months of careful work. And there was nothing the farmer could do but watch. Pests were another constant threat. Locusts, in particular, were a farmer's nightmare. In a matter of hours, a swarm could descend from the sky, stripping every leaf, stalk, and fruit. Nothing remained but bare soil and ruined hopes. Ancient texts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Bible all describe the terror of locust plagues, which came without warning and left famine in their wake. Smaller insects, like aphids or beetles, could also cause slow, creeping damage. Birds might feast on seeds or peck at growing grains. Rodents could burrow into fields, nibbling roots and tunneling through irrigation channels. Farmers fought back as best they could, but their tools were simple: scarecrows, traps, hand-picking pests from plants. Every night brought the risk that new invaders would arrive. Disease, too, could strike plants without warning. Ancient farmers had no understanding of bacteria, fungi, or viruses. All they saw were mysterious blights, spots on leaves, withered stalks, or mold spreading across fruits. Once disease took hold, there was often little they could do to stop it. Human threats also loomed. In unstable times, raiders or desperate neighbors might steal crops or damage fields. A year of bad weather in one village might lead hungry people to invade another's storehouse. Laws against theft existed, but in the face of starvation, desperation often overpowered legal fears. And so the waiting continued. The farmer walked his fields each morning, inspecting the plants with a practiced eye. Were the leaves turning the right shade of green? Were the stalks standing straight? Were there any signs of rot, wilt, or strange pests? Each observation brought either a small sigh of relief or a heavy knot of worry. The farmer's family shared in the tension. Wives, children, and elders all contributed to the daily care of the fields. Even small children helped scare birds away, or carry water to parched plants. The entire household's survival depended on the success of these fragile plants. Religious rituals became part of the waiting. Offerings were made to gods of rain, sun, and fertility. In Mesopotamia, sacrifices might be offered to Ishtar or Enlil. In Egypt, prayers were whispered to Osiris and Hapi, the Nile god. In Greece, Demeter received gifts of first fruits and libations. These acts were not mere tradition, they were desperate appeals for mercy. Oracles and omens were also consulted. A sudden flight of birds, a dream, or the behavior of animals might be seen as signs of the season's fate. Priests interpreted these symbols, offering comfort or warning, to the anxious farming communities. As the plants grew taller, the stakes grew higher. A field close to harvest represented months of labor and hope concentrated into fragile stalks of grain or rows of ripening fruits. A single storm, fire, or invasion could still take everything away. And then, at last, came the signs of readiness. The heads of wheat turned golden. The ears of barley grew heavy and full. The fruits swelled on the trees and vines. The long wait neared its end, but a new race against time now began. Harvest was both a relief and a frantic struggle. Crops had to be gathered quickly, before weather or animals could spoil them. Families and neighbors worked from dawn to dusk, cutting grain with simple sickles, gathering fruits by hand, or shaking olives from trees. In some communities, harvest festivals were held after the last sheaves were safely stored, a brief moment of joy after months of tension. But even the harvest was not without danger. Accidents could happen, tools were sharp, and fields were large. Injuries were common, and in times of exhaustion, mistakes could be deadly. The work was backbreaking, requiring hours of bending, lifting, and hauling. In the heat of summer, dehydration and heat stroke posed serious risks. Once harvested, crops had to be carefully processed and stored. Grain needed to be threshed to separate kernels from husks. Winnowing removed the lighter chaff. Fruits and vegetables were dried, salted, or fermented to last through the winter. Poor storage could ruin an entire year's work. Mold, rot, or pests could creep into granaries and cellars. The storage process introduced new worries. Rodents, insects, and damp air were constant threats. Entire families might sleep near their stored food, guarding it as though it were gold. In many ways, the harvest was not truly safe until it had been eaten. And so, the cycle of planting, waiting, harvesting, and storing continued year after year. Each season brought new lessons, new challenges, and new hopes. The long wait from planting to harvest was a quiet, tense gamble against forces far beyond any farmer's control. For the ancient farmer, patience was not just a virtue, it was a matter of survival. The fields whispered their slow promises, and the farmer listened, worked, and waited. And sometimes, when the rains came right, when the sun was gentle, and the pests stayed away, those long months of waiting finally ended in a full storehouse, and a family fed for another year. Even after months of careful planting, nurturing, and waiting, the ancient farmer's battle with nature was far from over. In truth, it was never truly over. At any point, nature could turn suddenly hostile, delivering misfortunes that wiped away an entire season's worth of labor and hope. Pests, plagues, and natural disasters were the ever-present shadows hovering over ancient fields. For the ancient world, pests were not a minor annoyance. They were catastrophic. Chief among these threats was the locust. Few creatures could destroy food as swiftly and completely as these winged swarms. Locusts would descend like clouds, blocking out the sun. Their jaws tore through fields with astonishing speed, consuming every blade of grass, every leaf, and every ear of grain. What was once green and full of life became a wasteland of stripped stems and dry dust. Ancient texts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Hebrew Bible speak of locusts as one of the most feared curses. Entire regions could be left starving after a single swarm. And the worst part, there was no real defense. Farmers beat drums, lit fires, and tried to scare the insects away, but these efforts were usually in vain. The locusts moved where the wind carried them, indifferent to the desperation of the people below. Beyond locusts, countless smaller pests also posed threats. Aphids sucked the juices from tender plants. Beetles chewed through leaves and stems. Mice and rats burrowed through grain stores, ruining what little had been gathered. Snails and slugs might destroy gardens overnight. Each type of pest attacked in its own way, creating a constant need for vigilance. Birds could devastate newly planted fields, plucking seeds from the ground before they even had a chance to sprout. Scarecrows, simple nets, and loud noises were used to try and protect the seeds, but birds were clever and persistent. Even today, in parts of the world where farming is done by hand, children are sometimes stationed in fields all day just to wave sticks and shout at hungry flocks. And yet, the farmer's worries extended far beyond animals and insects. Plant diseases, mysterious and unstoppable, could creep into fields without warning. In an era before anyone understood germs or fungi, blights were terrifying. A healthy crop one week might turn black and withered the next. Leaves spotted and yellowed, stalks drooped and collapsed. The cause was invisible, and no remedy was known. Fungal infections were especially deadly in damp climates. Smuts, rusts, and molds would spread across grains, rendering them inedible or toxic. Some molds produced poisons that sickened or killed those who unknowingly ate the contaminated harvest. Ergot fungus, for example, could infect rye, leading to hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. The afflicted might believe themselves cursed or possessed, unable to explain their agony. But even if pests and diseases were kept at bay, nature still held greater weapons. Floods could wash away entire fields in a matter of hours. Rivers swollen by unexpected rains would burst their banks, turning farmlands into muddy lakes. Valuable topsoil, seeds, and young plants would be swept downstream, never to return. Houses and storehouses were often built on higher ground for this very reason, but fields could not always be so easily protected. Drought was an equally deadly foe. Weeks or months without rain left fields parched and cracked. Seeds failed to sprout, and existing plants withered under the merciless sun. Wells ran dry, rivers shrank, and irrigation channels turned to dust. Without water, no amount of labor could save the crop. Starvation loomed as the grain stores emptied faster than they could be refilled. Extreme temperatures posed additional dangers. Late spring frosts could kill young plants before they had a chance to grow. Early autumn frosts could ruin ripening grains and fruits, rendering them useless just days before harvest. Intense summer heat could scorch leaves and dry out roots, leaving fields scorched and empty. The ancient farmer watched the skies anxiously every day, hoping for just the right balance of warmth and coolness. Storms brought their own violent fury. Hailstones could crush tender plants into pulp in minutes. Lightning set fires that swept through fields, devouring crops, fences, and sometimes even entire villages. Powerful winds could flatten fields of wheat or uproot fruit trees in a single night. The farmer could only watch, helpless against the raw power of nature. Earthquakes, while less frequent, could still ruin farmland. Cracked irrigation channels, shifted river courses, and collapsed terraces could make formerly fertile land useless. And in coastal regions, tsunamis occasionally swept entire settlements and fields into the sea. Then there were the disasters that stretched far beyond the farm itself. War could drive farmers from their fields, leaving crops untended and vulnerable. Armies might trample or burn fields as they marched, whether to starve enemies or simply out of carelessness. Even the victors of such wars often found themselves with no food left to harvest. Plagues among humans could also devastate farming communities. Disease outbreaks might leave entire villages too sick or dead to plant or harvest. With too few hands to work the land, fields were abandoned, and crops rotted in place. The Black Death in medieval Europe famously led to this very scenario centuries later. But even in the ancient world, waves of sickness often led to widespread famine. Famine, in turn, fed into even more suffering. Starving populations weakened quickly. Diseases spread faster among the malnourished. Desperate people stole from each other, raided neighbors, or sold themselves into slavery for a scrap of bread. Hunger made people take terrible risks. Religious explanations often filled the gap left by a lack of scientific knowledge. Many believed that plagues of pests or bad harvests were punishments from angry gods or signs of divine displeasure. Priests offered sacrifices to appease these forces. In times of prolonged disaster, entire communities might perform rituals, processions, or fasts, hoping for mercy. Some farmers attempted practical countermeasures where they could. They built canals to redirect floodwaters, or dug cisterns to capture precious rain. Stone walls or hedges were planted as windbreaks. Mixed planting, growing different crops together, sometimes helped reduce losses if one type failed. But even the most careful farmer was ultimately at the mercy of forces beyond control. The sheer unpredictability of ancient farming shaped entire cultures. It encouraged traditions of generosity in times of surplus, for everyone knew that next year might bring disaster. It bred caution and frugality, as storehouses were built to hold extra grain for lean years. It also created tight-knit communities where neighbors helped one another because survival often depended on mutual aid. Yet, for all its dangers, ancient farming persisted. Generation after generation planted their seeds, knowing that disaster might strike, but hoping that this year, the rains would fall gently, the sun would shine kindly, and the pests would stay away. They lived with nature's cruelty, but also its generosity. And when a good harvest came, it was celebrated not only for its abundance, but for the long chain of dangers that had been, for one season at least, narrowly avoided. The ancient farmer's life was one of constant uncertainty, yet they faced it with remarkable resilience. Every seed sown was a gamble against disaster, but it was also a prayer for life. When we imagine the ancient farmer, we often picture a simple person working with bare hands, stooped beneath the hot sun. And while much of farming did indeed depend on human strength and patience, ancient farmers also developed a variety of tools to help them survive their endless battle with the soil. These tools may appear crude to us today, but they were the best technology available for their time. Every improvement, no matter how small, could mean the difference between hunger and survival. Let us begin with the most basic and essential of farming tools, the digging stick. In the earliest days of agriculture, when humans first learned to plant seeds, this simple stick was their primary tool. Often made from hardwood, sharpened at one end by fire or cutting, it allowed early farmers to poke holes in the earth where seeds could be dropped. In some regions, digging sticks were fitted with stone or bone tips for extra durability. Over time, as farming became more sophisticated, digging sticks evolved into hoes. The hoe was one of the most important agricultural inventions. A simple blade, often made of wood, stone, or later, metal, was attached to a long handle. This allowed the farmer to till the soil more efficiently, breaking up clumps and clearing weeds without having to bend over constantly. In many ancient societies, hoes were used not just for planting but for almost every stage of field preparation. The plow was another major advancement. Its invention revolutionized farming by allowing larger fields to be cultivated with less manual effort. The earliest plows were little more than heavy wooden frames dragged through the soil. Sometimes called ards, these primitive plows scratched shallow, froze into the earth, making it easier to drop seeds in straight rows. In some parts of the world, such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, the plow was pulled by animals, usually oxen or donkeys. The strength of these animals allowed farmers to break tougher soils and cover more ground in less time. However, owning draft animals was a luxury not all farmers could afford. Many small-scale farmers still had to pull their own plows or rely entirely on hoes and digging sticks. Sowing the seeds was another task requiring precision. Early farmers would broadcast seeds by hand, scattering them across the freshly tilled earth. This method was simple but often wasteful, as some seeds landed too close together while others fell on barren patches. More experienced farmers learned techniques to scatter more evenly, or even planted by hand into small furrows to improve yields. Once seeds were planted, the fields needed constant attention. Weeding was done by hand or with small hand-held hoes. This was grueling work requiring farmers to crawl row by row, removing invasive plants that competed for water and nutrients. A single missed weed could spread quickly, choking out valuable crops. Watering the crops demanded yet another set of tools and techniques. In regions blessed with rivers, such as the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates, irrigation systems were carefully built and maintained. These systems included canals, ditches, and reservoirs, all dug by hand with shovels and baskets. The ancient Egyptians perfected a tool called the shatif, a long pole with a counterweight and bucket, used to lift water from the river and pour it into irrigation channels. Elsewhere, farmers used simple clay pipes or wooden troughs to carry water to their fields. In areas without rivers, farmers collected rainwater in cisterns or small ponds, drawing it out bucket by bucket. The labor involved in watering even a small field was enormous. Every drop of water meant backbreaking work. Harvest time brought its own set of tools. The sickle, with its curved blade, was one of the most iconic symbols of ancient agriculture. Early sickles were made from stone blades set into wooden handles, but eventually, bronze and iron blades became common. The curved shape allowed farmers to efficiently cut stalks of grain near the base, gathering large bundles to be carried away for threshing. Threshing, the process of separating grain from the stalk, was often done by beating the bundles with sticks or allowing animals to trample them on a hard floor. Threshing sledges, made of wooden boards, with embedded stones or metal blades, were also used in some regions, dragged across the piles to break apart the grain heads. Winnowing came next. Farmers would toss the threshed grain into the air using wide, flat baskets or wooden forks. The lighter chaff blew away on the wind, while the heavier grains fell back to the ground. This simple technique, though physically exhausting, was remarkably effective. On windy days, the process was much easier, though one had to be careful not to lose too much grain to strong gusts. Storing the harvested grain presented its own challenges. Clay jars, woven baskets, and underground pits were commonly used for storage. Some societies built large granaries made of mud brick or stone, raised off the ground to protect against moisture and pests. The tools used for storage were often simple: wooden scoops, stone grinders, and clay pots, but they were essential for preserving food through the lean months ahead. Grinding grain into flour was another labor-intensive task. The quern, a simple hand-operated grinding stone, was used for centuries across many cultures. A large flat stone served as the base, while a smaller handheld stone was used to crush the grain against it. Women and slaves often spent hours each day grinding enough flour to make daily bread. As primitive as these tools may seem to modern eyes, they represented a slow and steady march of innovation. Each improvement, whether a sharper blade, a sturdier plow, or a more efficient irrigation system, allowed farmers to feed more people, survive harsher climates, and store food more securely. Tools also varied greatly by region. In rice-growing regions of ancient China, farmers developed wooden, planting frames to space seedlings evenly. In the Americas, the Inca built sophisticated terraces and irrigation systems high in the Andes, using stone tools and clever engineering. In Africa, farmers developed specialized hoes and digging sticks suited to their particular soils and crops. The design of tools was also shaped by the materials available. Societies with access to metal ores could create bronze and iron implements far superior to those still using stone and wood. The spread of metalworking knowledge transformed agriculture wherever it appeared, making it easier to clear land, till the soil, and harvest larger fields. Yet, even with better tools, farming remained overwhelmingly physical labor. A single farmer might still spend sunrise to sunset bent over the fields, sweat pouring from his brow as he worked through each stage of the cycle. Tools lightened the burden but never eliminated it. The farmer's body remained his most important, and most fragile, instrument. The simplicity of ancient tools also meant they were vulnerable to wear and damage. Wooden handles snapped, stone blades dulled and chipped, metal rusted or bent. Farmers had to constantly repair, replace, and sometimes invent solutions on the spot to keep their tools functioning. A broken plow at the wrong moment could jeopardize the entire season's crop. In many ways, the ancient farmer was also an inventor and a craftsman. He knew how to sharpen blades, carve handles, patch leather straps, and improvise when disaster struck. His tools were extensions of his own hands, passed down through generations and carefully maintained year after year. At night, after long days in the fields, the farmer might sit beside the fire, rubbing oil into wooden handles, sharpening blades against a stone, or repairing a cracked bucket with sinew or rope. These quiet tasks were as essential as any work done in the sunlight. A well-maintained tool was a small bit of protection against the ever-present threat of nature's unpredictability. The simple tools of ancient farmers tell a story of human persistence. They remind us that farming, even in its earliest days, was a delicate balance of knowledge, skill, and constant hard work. And though their technology was simple, the ancient farmers managed to feed entire civilizations with little more than sharp sticks, stones, animal power, and their own endless determination. Water? So simple, so ordinary, and yet for the ancient farmer, it was everything. The difference between life and death, between a full granary and a winter of hunger. In the ancient world, managing water was one of the most complicated and nerve-wracking parts of farming. Too little, and the crops withered. Too much, and the fields drowned. The problem was not just rainfall itself, but when and how it came. In many places, the year was divided into wet and dry seasons. If the rains arrived too late, seeds might fail to sprout. If they came too early or too hard, seedlings could be washed away, and fragile young plants destroyed by rushing water. For much of the ancient world, farming was built around rivers. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus. These great rivers brought both opportunity and danger. Their annual floods deposited rich silt on the surrounding land, creating some of the most fertile soil on earth. But if those floods were too strong or too weak, disaster followed. Take the Nile, for example. Every summer, snowmelt from distant mountains swelled the river. The flood waters spread across the flat Egyptian fields, leaving behind a layer of nutrient-rich mud as they receded. This rhythm of flooding had sustained Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. The farmers carefully watched the rising waters, hoping for just the right amount. If the flood was too small, the soil would be dry and unproductive. If it was too large, villages and fields could be swept away. Each year brought a nervous waiting game. Priests and officials recorded the height of the waters, offering prayers and sacrifices to the gods for balance. The Tigris and Euphrates posed even greater challenges. Unlike the predictable Nile, these rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes at the worst possible moments during the growing season. Sudden flash floods could wash away entire harvests. Controlling these rivers required complex networks of canals, levees, dikes, and reservoirs. The people of Mesopotamia were some of the earliest master engineers of water, out of sheer necessity. Canals channeled floodwaters safely through farmland, spreading moisture evenly across fields. Reservoirs held excess water for drier times. But building and maintaining these systems was exhausting work. Laborers dug canals with hand tools, baskets, shovels, and sheer muscle. Every storm could undo months of back-breaking effort. Irrigation itself was both a blessing and a curse. While it allowed farmers to grow crops even during dry spells, it also brought new dangers. Poor drainage led to waterlogging, which suffocated plant roots. Over time, repeated irrigation could raise the water table and bring salts to the surface, slowly poisoning the soil, a problem known as salinization. In parts of ancient Mesopotamia, vast stretches of farmland eventually became too salty to grow crops. Entire cities declined as once productive fields turned into barren wastelands. The very system that sustained life could, if not carefully managed, slowly destroy it. For those without access to rivers, the situation was even harder. Farmers in dry regions relied entirely on rain. They prayed to the gods for good rains. They watched the skies, reading the clouds and the winds like ancient scientists. A failed rainy season meant certain famine. There was no backup plan. In some places, people developed ingenious ways to capture and store what little water they could. In the Near East, stone cisterns carved into hillsides collected rainwater during the brief wet season, providing drinking water for months afterward. Wells were dug, sometimes incredibly deep, to tap hidden underground springs. But digging and maintaining wells was dangerous, expensive work. Other regions mastered the art of tracing. In hilly or mountainous lands, farmers carved flat steps into the hillsides. These terraces captured rainfall and prevented soil erosion, creating small, manageable plots where water could soak into the ground rather than running off. The Incas of the Andes, the Chinese in mountainous regions, and others used terracing for centuries. Perhaps one of the most remarkable ancient irrigation systems was the kanat, developed in Persia. Kanats were underground tunnels that gently sloped downward from mountain foothills to bring groundwater to the surface, often across many miles. Protected from evaporation by their underground path, kanats allowed farming even in harsh desert climates. Digging them, however, was perilous. Workers risked cave-ins, suffocation, and exhaustion to create these lifelines. Despite all these efforts, drought remained a constant fear. When rains failed, rivers shrank, wells dried up, and canals turned to mud. The people were left helpless. Cattle died. Crops shriveled. Grain prices soared, and famine spread rapidly. Ancient texts are filled with accounts of drought-induced suffering, entire cities abandoned, populations migrating in desperate search of water. But even too much water could be deadly. Floods not only ruined crops, but sometimes permanently changed the landscape. In the Yellow River basin of China, catastrophic floods repeatedly burst through fragile dikes, killing thousands and burying fields under layers of silt. The river earned the grim nickname, China's Sorrow, for its relentless destruction. The constant struggle with water shaped every part of ancient farming life. It determined where people built their homes. It determined what crops they planted. It even shaped religious beliefs. Many ancient gods and goddesses were associated with rain, rivers, and fertility. Entire ceremonies were held to beg for rain or to give thanks for a flood that brought life instead of death. Farmers became careful observers of nature. They learned to read subtle signs, the color of clouds, the behavior of animals, the direction of winds, to predict rainfall. Old proverbs and folk wisdom about weather patterns were passed down through generations. These observations, while not always accurate, were often surprisingly insightful. The unpredictability of water also shaped ancient government. In many civilizations, rulers organized large-scale irrigation projects that required armies of laborers and complex planning. Pharaohs, kings, and emperors claimed divine favor when floods were mild and harvests were good, and faced rebellion when they were not. Managing water was not just a technical challenge, it was a political one. In times of severe drought or flooding, entire civilizations could crumble. The decline of the Akkadian Empire, one of the first great empires of Mesopotamia, is thought by some historians to have been hastened by prolonged drought. Without enough water, the great cities emptied, fields lay fallow, and once mighty armies disbanded. Even today, archaeologists uncover evidence of ancient canals, dikes, and waterworks. These silent remains remind us of the enormous effort our ancestors invested in their battle with water. The same fields that once flourished thanks to clever irrigation now lie dry and empty, their farmers long gone. For the ancient farmer, every season was a wager against the forces of nature. He could till his field with skill. He could plant at the perfect moment. He could weed and guard his crops. But when it came to water, too much, or too little, he was always at the mercy of forces far beyond his control. And yet, year after year, they returned to the fields, digging canals, patching levees, praying for rain, hoping that, just this once, the balance of water and land would be kind. And sometimes, for a brief season, it was. In the quiet fields of ancient times, every tiny seed carried enormous weight. The seed was not merely a promise of food. It was hope, survival, and the fragile line between plenty and hunger. But not all seeds were equal. The ancient farmer's world was one of experimentation, trial and, often, painful error as they sought the best crops for their uncertain environment. Unlike today's standardized, genetically selected seeds, the ancient farmer dealt with a wild diversity of plant types. Many of the grains, vegetables, and fruits that would later become stable crops began as wild plants, barely domesticated, prone to failure, and wildly variable from one planting to the next. Let us begin with wheat. Wheat was one of the first major crops to be domesticated, especially in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East. But even wheat came in many forms: emmer, einkorn, and later durum and bread wheat. Each type had different strengths and weaknesses. Some tolerated drought better. Others produced more grain but were more fragile in wind or rain. The farmer had to choose wisely. Emmer wheat, for example, was hardy and reliable, but its grain was tightly wrapped in a tough husk. This made harvesting and processing much more labor-intensive. Yet, for many centuries, emmer was the preferred wheat because it was sturdy against pests and poor soil. Barley was another ancient staple. More tolerant of salty soils and irregular water, barley often succeeded where wheat failed. In places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, barley became the backbone of both bread and beer. But barley's shorter, growing season meant that it often produced less grain. Again, the farmer faced a careful balance. Lentils, peas, and beans, small and humble, were among the earliest domesticated legumes. They restored nitrogen to the soil and offered crucial protein for ancient diets. Yet, even here, the farmer needed to test varieties that could survive different weather patterns, soil conditions, and pests. In ancient China, millet was a dominant crop, thriving in the dry, lowest soils of the Yellow River Basin. Millet was resilient to drought but produced tiny seeds that required tedious harvesting. Over time, rice emerged in the wetter regions, but rice demanded far more water management. The transition between millet and rice was not smooth. It was generations of patient experimentation. In the Americas, ancient farmers worked with an entirely different palette of plants. Maize, or corn, was originally a wild grass called teosinte, with tiny, hard kernels barely worth harvesting. Through careful selection over thousands of years, indigenous farmers transformed it into the large, productive ears we know today. But early maize was unpredictable, and farmers constantly experimented with planting times, spacing, and field locations. Squash, beans, and maize, the so-called Three Sisters, were planted together in North America. Their growth supported one another. Beans climbed the maize stalks, squash covered the ground to retain moisture, and together they balanced soil nutrients. But this system, too, had to be perfected through countless seasons of trial and error. The choice of seeds also depended on storage. Some grains kept better than others. Spoiled seed stock could ruin an entire planting season. Rats, mold, and insects could destroy precious stores. Careful farmers selected only the healthiest, plumpest seeds from their best harvests to set aside for the next year. But even the best preparation could not predict the future. A sudden cold snap, an unseasonable drought, or a new wave of pests could wipe out a carefully chosen crop. Ancient farmers developed an almost instinctual knowledge of their land, a deep understanding of which fields were warmer, which drained better, which were more exposed to wind. Sometimes, farmers experimented by planting several types of crops together, a method known as intercropping. This way, if one crop failed, another might survive. Diversity offered some protection against total loss. Monoculture, the practice of planting only one crop, was far too risky in ancient times. Farmers also developed regional strains of plants adapted to local conditions. Seeds were traded, gifted, or stolen across ancient trade routes. A strain of wheat from one valley might perform better when planted hundreds of miles away under slightly different conditions. Knowledge of these plant varieties spread slowly, but steadily across empires and continents. Experimentation wasn't limited to crops alone. Ancient farmers continually tested planting techniques. How deep should the seeds be buried? How far apart should they be spaced? Should they rotate fields every season or every few years? These experiments were not guided by modern science, but by keen observation, oral tradition, and often superstition. A successful harvest was seen as a reward not only for hard work, but for choosing the right planting ritual, the right moon phase, or the right day blessed by the gods. Over time, certain methods became tradition. These traditions, passed from parent to child, formed the backbone of ancient agricultural knowledge. And yet, nature continually tested these customs with unexpected changes in climate, pests, and disease. Crop rotation slowly emerged as a valuable technique. By alternating which crops grew where, farmers preserved soil nutrients and reduced pest infestations. But rotation patterns varied widely between regions, adapted to the particular needs of the land and the knowledge available to the farmers. Seed exchanges between communities were both practical and cultural. At local markets, farmers traded not only food but seeds, sharing stories of which strains had succeeded or failed under recent weather. This slow network of seed sharing helped maintain genetic diversity, which was critical for long-term survival. And yet, no matter how carefully chosen the seeds or how experienced the farmer, uncertainty always loomed. A year's work could be undone by a single night of frost, a swarm of locusts, or an unexpected deluge. There were no guarantees, only cautious hope. The ancient farmer's relationship with seeds was one of both mastery and humility. Each season was a negotiation with nature, a delicate attempt to balance human skill with forces far beyond their control. Success was never assured, but failure was always close at hand. In the quiet moments before planting, perhaps kneeling in the froze, the farmer would hold the seeds carefully, saying silent prayers or recalling lessons from ancestors long gone. With every handful scattered into the soil, there was a silent bargain: if the weather is kind, if the pests stay away, if the rivers do not flood, this seed may become life. And so they planted. Year after year. Hoping. Watching. Learning. Experimenting with what little they had against the great, unpredictable powers of nature. As the ancient farmer planted his seeds with care, there was always a gnawing fear that lingered in the back of his mind. Even if the rains came at the right time, even if the sun shone gently, and even if the soil was rich, the greatest threats might still arrive unexpectedly. These threats came crawling, flying, burrowing, and multiplying. They were the pests and plagues, the silent armies that could turn fields of promise into barren wastelands overnight. Insects were among the earliest and most relentless enemies of ancient crops. Locusts, in particular, were a farmer's worst nightmare. When conditions were right, usually after a period of heavy rain followed by warmth, locust populations exploded. Swarms would gather by the millions, darkening the sky as they moved like living storms across entire regions. The damage they inflicted was almost unimaginable. In a matter of hours, they could strip fields bare, devouring leaves, stems, and even the bark of young trees. Nothing green remained. Farmers watched helplessly as months of hard labor vanished in the clicking, buzzing swarm. Locust plagues were recorded in some of the oldest written texts. The Bible describes them as one of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Ancient Sumerian, Egyptian, and Chinese records all mention their devastation. No fence or wall could stop them. Fire, noise, and smoke were sometimes used in desperate attempts to drive them away, but rarely succeeded. But locusts were only one of many threats. Other insects made their attacks more quietly, but no less destructively. Aphids, for example, sucked the sap from tender shoots, stunting growth and spreading plant diseases. Grain beetles burrowed into stored harvests, turning food stores into powdery waste. Cutworms chewed through young stems at ground level, felling seedlings like tiny lumberjacks in the night. Rodents posed another constant menace. Mice and rats invaded fields and storage granaries alike, feasting on seeds and ripening grain. With their high breeding rates, a small population of rodents could explode into an infestation within weeks. Farmers set traps, kept cats, and built granaries on raised platforms, or with smooth plastered walls to discourage climbing, but these methods were never fully effective. Larger animals also threatened crops. Flocks of birds descended to gorge on ripening seeds. In many regions, farmers employed boys or elderly family members to guard fields all day, shouting, waving flags, and throwing stones to frighten away the flocks. Scarecrows and noisemakers were used, though birds often grew bold enough to ignore them. And then there were the diseases, silent killers that struck plants from within. Fungal blights could turn once healthy crops into sickly, rotting messes. Rusts covered leaves with orange or black powder. Smuts infected grain heads, replacing kernels with foul, black spores. Mildews coated leaves, blocking sunlight and starving the plant. The worst part was that farmers often had little understanding of what caused these plagues. Without knowledge of microbes or fungi, they might blame the gods, evil spirits, or bad omens. Sometimes whole fields were abandoned, considered cursed or haunted. Rituals and offerings were made in the hopes of restoring balance and health to the land. Weeds were yet another foe. Competing with crops for sunlight, water, and nutrients, aggressive weeds could choke out young plants before they had a chance to mature. Some ancient farmers painstakingly weeded their fields by hand or with crude hoes. Others relied on animal grazing before planting to clear the land. Yet, no matter the method, weeds always returned. Even the soil itself could betray the farmer. After years of cultivation, essential nutrients could be exhausted. Without knowledge of fertilizers or crop rotation, many ancient fields gradually lost their fertility. In some regions, this forced farmers to abandon old fields and clear new land, a cycle that was never sustainable forever. Natural disasters compounded these difficulties. Hailstorms could shred fields in minutes. High winds flattened ripening crops just before harvest. Sudden freezes killed tender shoots in the spring, or ruined fruit in the fall. Lightning strikes ignited fires that spread across dry fields. Disease wasn't limited to plants, either. Livestock illnesses could indirectly affect agriculture. Sick animals could no longer pull plows or provide manure for fertilizing fields. The loss of draft animals could reduce a family's ability to prepare fields in time for planting. The cumulative effect of all these threats was psychological as well as physical. Ancient farmers lived in a state of constant worry. Even after planting, and months of careful tending, disaster could still strike at any moment. Every gathering cloud or unexpected insect sighting was a potential sign of ruin. Communities often worked together to share knowledge of pest control methods. Some burned fields after harvest to kill pest eggs and disease spores. Others experimented with companion planting, growing certain plants together to deter insects. Aromatic herbs and strong-smelling plants were believed to repel certain pests. Ash and sand were sometimes sprinkled around young plants to discourage crawling insects. In certain regions, farmers engaged in cooperative pest patrols. Communities might send groups into fields to catch and destroy early outbreaks of locusts or rodent nests. Success was never certain, but unity offered some protection where individuals would fail alone. Religious and superstitious practices also played a large role. Prayers were offered to deities believed to control pests and diseases. In Mesopotamia, farmers might appeal to Nisaba, goddess of grain. In Egypt, rituals might honor Osiris or Geb, asking for protection from crop blights. The ancient Greeks might pray to Demeter, goddess of the harvest, for relief from pestilence. And yet, despite these efforts, many seasons ended in failure. Starvation, debt, and migration were frequent consequences of repeated crop loss. Poor harvests could ripple through entire societies, weakening states, triggering wars, and toppling kings. Still, the farmer returned each year to the soil. The cycle of planting, tending, and hoping continued. For every disaster, there was always a season of abundance that renewed hope. And so, they endured. The fields may have been full of enemies, both seen and unseen, but the courage of the ancient farmer was in never surrendering to despair. With each sunrise, they looked to the horizon, ready to face whatever nature might send next. In the quiet rhythm of seed, soil, and sky, life continued. At last, after months of labor, prayer, and waiting, the ancient fields began to ripen. The long, uncertain gamble with nature approached its most critical moment, harvest time. This was the reward every farmer hoped for, yet even now, danger lurked close. A successful harvest required not only good fortune but quick, careful, and often exhausting work. The first signs of readiness were carefully watched. The heads of wheat grew heavy and bent. The barley's golden stalks swayed gently in the summer breeze. The grains were no longer green but had dried under the sun, turning shades of gold, amber, or pale yellow. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the grains lacked weight and nourishment. Too late, and rains, wind, or animals might spoil everything. Harvest season was a time of great activity. Entire villages mobilized. Men, women, and children all took part in the gathering. Neighbors helped neighbors. Even distant relatives returned to lend their hands. The more people worked together, the faster the harvest could be secured. Sickles, simple curved blades, were the primary harvesting tools in many ancient cultures. These allowed workers to cut the grain stalks close to the ground, gathering handfuls that were then tied into bundles known as sheaves. The rhythmic motion of cutting and binding continued from sunrise to sunset. The work was backbreaking. Backs ached. Fingers blistered. Yet, with each sheaf secured, the danger of losing the crop diminished slightly. Once bundled, the sheaves were left in the fields to dry further under the sun. But this too carried risks. Sudden storms could soak the drying grain, inviting mold and rot. Birds and rodents seized the opportunity to feast. Guards or simple scarecrows were stationed nearby to protect the drying bundles. As soon as possible, the sheaves were transported to the threshing floors. These were flat, hard surfaces, sometimes simple patches of dirt or stone, where the next stage of processing began. Threshing involved separating the valuable grain from the stalks and husks. This could be done by hand, beating the sheaves with wooden flails, or by having animals trample them underfoot. Even this stage required care. If the grain was bruised or cracked during threshing, it could spoil in storage. Dust filled the air. The hot sun beat down. Threshing was dirty, difficult work, but absolutely necessary. Following threshing came winnowing. This was the process of removing the lighter chaff from the heavier grains. Farmers used baskets or simple winnowing forks, tossing the mixture into the air. The breeze carried away the lighter husks, while the heavier grain fell back to the ground. In places without wind, large fans or even careful hand sorting was required. Children often participated in winnowing, turning it into a kind of game. Still, this playful scene hid the tension beneath. A poor winnowing job meant more chaff in the stored grain, which could lead to faster spoilage or more work during cooking. Once cleaned, the grain was ready for storage, a stage no less critical than the harvest itself. Granaries took many forms. Some cultures built above-ground structures with raised platforms to keep pests out. Others dug deep silos into the earth, covering them with tightly sealed lids to keep out moisture and insects. But even in storage, threats remained. Rodents could chew through wooden barriers. Moisture could seep in unexpectedly. Insects laid eggs hidden within the grain. Fungal contamination turned precious food into dangerous poison. Some granaries failed silently, only discovered months later, when food was desperately needed. Because of these risks, ancient farmers often staggered their harvest times, spreading out the work over weeks. This helped reduce losses from sudden weather changes. It also gave families time to process each batch properly before moving on to the next. Not all crops were harvested at the same time. Fruits like grapes, figs, and olives had their own seasons and processes. Grapes, for example, had to be crushed soon after picking to prevent spoilage. Olives were either pressed quickly for oil or carefully stored in brine for preservation. Each harvest season had its own traditions, festivals, and religious rituals. In many cultures, offerings were made to the gods in gratitude for a successful harvest. In ancient Greece, the festival of Thesmophoria honored Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. In Egypt, celebrations honored Osiris, who symbolized the annual renewal of life. Harvest festivals were moments of both joy and relief. Food and drink flowed freely. Songs were sung. Dances were performed. For a brief time, The worries of hunger and toil were set aside. Families came together to celebrate the abundance that had been secured, at least for now. Yet, always in the background was the knowledge that winter loomed ahead. The months ahead would be spent carefully rationing the stored grain, praying that it would last until the next harvest season arrived. A single bad year could still lead to famine, despite all the hard work now completed. The harvest was never truly finished. Even after the grain was safely stored, farmers turned to preparing the fields for the next planting. Animal manure might be spread, weeds pulled, tools repaired. Life on the farm was an endless cycle, each stage blending into the next. For ancient farmers, harvest time was a mixture of triumph and vulnerability. It was the moment when months of labor came together in a fragile mountain of grain, exposed and delicate, depending on continued luck and vigilance to truly become sustenance. In these simple, timeless rhythms, entire civilizations found their heartbeat. The rustle of dry stalks in the breeze, the scrape of sickles through the fields, the laughter of children winnowing grain under the wide sky, and the quiet prayers whispered as each sack of grain was safely stored away. So the harvest passed, year after year. Some years bountiful, others bitter. Yet always the farmer returned, planting hope in the soil once more. The fields now stood empty. The golden waves of grain had been gathered, threshed, winnowed, and cleaned. The long days of labor had secured the harvest. Yet the farmer's work was far from over. The next great challenge was to keep the food alive through the long, uncertain months ahead. In ancient times, storage was as much a battle as growing the crops themselves. Without proper preservation, all the labor of the year could be lost silently. Spoilage was an invisible enemy, one that crept into granaries, barns, and pantries slowly, but with devastating effect. Grain was the heart of survival. It could be stored, ground into flour, boiled into porridge, or baked into bread. But storing it safely was an art that every ancient farmer needed to master. Granaries took many forms depending on geography, climate, and available materials. In the dry, hot lands of Mesopotamia and Egypt, some were simple mud brick buildings with thick walls that helped keep the heat out and the interior cool. These structures often had raised floors, allowing air to circulate beneath and helping to keep moisture and pests away. In cooler, wetter climates, granaries might be built of wood or stone, lifted off the ground on stilts or stone pillars. The gaps prevented rodents from climbing up easily. Smooth stone bases and metal plates were sometimes added to discourage nimble mice from reaching the precious grain. Sealed storage jars were another common solution. Large clay amphorae or pottery containers were carefully dried before filling. The grain was placed inside and the top sealed with wax, pitch, or tightly tied leather covers. This method worked well for smaller stores, particularly for wealthier households or temples with controlled supplies. In some cases, underground silos were dug directly into the ground. These storage pits were lined with straw, clay, or stone to help keep moisture out. A tight-fitting lid or stone slab would seal the top. The constant cool temperature of the earth helped preserve the grain for many months, sometimes even years if carefully maintained. Moisture was the eternal enemy. If dampness crept into the stored grain, mold could develop rapidly. Fungi such as ergot could poison the entire supply, causing illness or death if consumed. Moldy grain also lost its nutritional value, weakening those who depended on it during the lean months. Pests were another constant threat. Insects such as weevils and grain beetles laid their eggs within the kernels. The larvae fed silently, hollowing out the grain from within. In extreme infestations, entire stores could turn to dust. Rodents gnawed through walls and lids, leaving droppings and spreading disease. To combat these invaders, ancient farmers developed many strategies. Regular inspections were common. Grain was stirred, checked for foul smells, and examined for signs of movement. Some sprinkled ashes, fine sand, or even dried herbs among the grain to deter insects. Bay leaves, mint, and other aromatic plants were believed to repel pests naturally. Some regions practiced controlled drying before storage. The harvested grain was spread out under the sun for days, turned regularly to ensure even drying. Properly dried grain resisted mold far better. However, too much sun could crack the grains, making them vulnerable to spoilage. It was a delicate balance. Beyond grain, ancient peoples also needed to preserve fruits, vegetables, dairy, and meat. Each food type had its own fragile life cycle and preservation challenges. Fruits like figs, dates, grapes, and apricots were often sun-dried. Laid out on woven mats or stone slabs, the moisture was slowly drawn out by the dry air. Dried fruit could last for many months, providing sweetness during the barren winter. Vegetables might be dried, pickled, or stored in cool, dark cellars. Root crops such as onions, garlic, and turnips were hung from rafters or buried in sand-lined pits to extend their freshness. Pickling in vinegar, brine, or oil offered longer preservation but required careful sealing to prevent spoilage. Milk presented one of the most urgent preservation challenges. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, especially in warm climates. Ancient peoples turned to fermentation. Yogurt, kefir, and cheese allowed dairy nutrients to be stored far longer. Hard cheeses, aged properly, could last for many months, even traveling across long trade routes. Preserving meat was one of the most difficult tasks. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled rapidly. Smoking, salting, and drying were the primary methods. Salted meats, packed in barrels or wrapped in cloth, could survive long voyages or winter months. Smoke houses filled with hanging cuts extended the life of precious proteins. Honey, one of nature's longest-lasting foods, required little preservation. Sealed in jars, it remained edible for years, even decades. Archaeologists have discovered pots of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs still perfectly preserved after thousands of years. Even salt itself was a preservative treasure. In many ancient economies, salt was so valuable that it was used as currency. The word salary even comes from the Latin salarium, referring to Roman soldiers receiving salt as part of their pay. Preservation wasn't only about technology or knowledge. It was also deeply tied to religion, tradition, and superstition. Many believed that evil spirits caused food to spoil. Prayers, charms, and rituals were performed to protect stores. Offerings were sometimes made to gods or ancestors to ensure the grain remained safe. Despite their best efforts, losses were common. A family might open a storage jar, only to find mold, rot, or pests had claimed their food. Entire communities could be threatened if granaries failed. Famine lurked constantly in the shadows of even the most bountiful harvests. And yet, through ingenuity and experience, ancient farmers found ways to survive. They learned from failures. They shared knowledge. They adapted to the unpredictable world around them. Storage and preservation were never perfect, but they were enough. Enough to carry families through the winter. Enough to provide seed for the next planting season. Enough to sustain entire civilizations. In the quiet cool of the granary, with rows of sealed jars and stacked sacks, there was a sense of fragile security. Outside, the world remained wild and unpredictable. But within those walls, for a time, the harvest lived on. And so, the cycle of ancient farming turned once more. From planting to harvest, from storage to survival. A timeless rhythm, both fragile and enduring. Even the most skilled ancient farmers understood a truth they could not escape. Nature was their silent partner. And sometimes, it turned against them. Not just in small ways, but in great, sweeping changes that brought entire civilizations to their knees. Today, we call it climate change. In ancient times, it was simply called bad luck, the wrath of gods, or a mystery. But its effects were just as devastating. The weather patterns ancient farmers depended on were never truly stable. Seasons shifted. Rains arrived late or not at all. Floods overwhelmed carefully planted fields. Frosts came early, killing young shoots. Summers grew too hot, baking crops before they ripened. Sometimes these changes lasted for a single year, but at other times, they stretched on for decades or even centuries. And when they did, the results were catastrophic. In the ancient Near East, one such crisis unfolded around 2200 BCE. This period is known today as the 4.2 kiloyear event. For reasons still debated, the climate suddenly shifted toward prolonged drought. Rainfall decreased dramatically. Rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates shrank. Farmlands turned to dust. Cities that once flourished began to starve. The Akkadian Empire, one of the world's first great empires, collapsed. Its farmers could no longer support its grand cities. Migration followed. Conflicts over shrinking resources erupted, and the empire fell into ruin. Similar stories appeared elsewhere. In ancient Egypt, the Nile was life itself. Its annual floodwaters deposited rich silt across the valley, making agriculture possible. But when the floods failed, as they sometimes did, famine quickly followed. Droughts in Egypt's Old Kingdom contributed to political collapse and widespread suffering. In China, ancient farmers along the Yellow River faced their own climate struggles. Shifts in monsoon patterns brought devastating floods one year and crippling drought the next. Each change threatened their fragile hold on food security. Even small climate changes could disrupt entire regions. A few cooler summers shortened growing seasons. Extended droughts dried out pasture lands for livestock. Forests shrank. Rivers altered their courses. In the world of ancient farming, these changes could mean life or death. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Across the eastern Mediterranean, great cities fell. Trade networks disintegrated. Societies crumbled. Archaeological evidence suggests that prolonged drought and crop failure played a major role. Food shortages led to migration, warfare, and ultimately the fall of entire civilizations. The ancient Maya civilization faced a similar fate centuries later. Their grand stone cities rose from dense jungles, supported by intricate farming systems. But as the climate dried and rains failed, agriculture declined. Starvation spread. The population dwindled. And one by one, great Maya cities were abandoned. The causes of these ancient climate shifts remain complex. Volcanic eruptions could inject ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight for years. Changes in ocean currents altered rainfall patterns across continents. Cycles in the Earth's orbit slowly shifted the balance of heat and cold. Solar activity fluctuated. And sometimes, these factors combined in ways that ancient peoples could neither predict nor control. Unlike today, ancient societies had little way to adapt on a large scale. They could not import food from distant lands. They lacked modern storage and transportation. When their fields failed, their entire way of life was endangered. Many turned to their gods for answers. Sacrifices increased. Temples filled with desperate prayers. In some cultures, people believed they had angered divine forces. Rituals to appease the gods grew more elaborate. Yet the rains still failed to come. Starving populations often moved in search of better lands. This migration led to conflict as groups clashed over scarce resources. Wars erupted. Cities were sacked. Whole regions emptied. Sometimes, clever adaptations bought time. Farmers switched crops, planting more drought-tolerant grains like barley or millet. Irrigation systems grew more complex. Storage technologies improved. But in the face of extreme, prolonged change, even these measures were often not enough. Climate change didn't always bring only drought. Sometimes it brought too much water. Floods could wipe out entire seasons of planting. Rivers changed course, leaving fields dry or submerged. Coastal areas faced storms and rising waters that ruined farmland and settlements alike. The story of ancient farming is a story of resilience. Again and again, people rebuilt. They replanted. They moved to new lands. They learned, adapted, and tried once more. But always, Behind their efforts was the quiet, uncontrollable power of nature. A partner one could never fully trust. A partner capable of both generosity and cruelty. In the modern world, we study these ancient climate events with satellites, ice cores, and tree rings. We piece together how the rains shifted, how temperatures changed, and how great empires fell. But for those who lived through it, there were no explanations. Only hunger. Only fear. Only hope that next season might be kinder. And so, for the ancient farmer standing beneath a cloudless sky, scanning empty fields, the gamble with nature was never truly over. Every harvest, every seed, was a wager placed against a world far larger than themselves. Yet still, they sowed. Still, they prayed. Still, they hoped. In the quiet fields of ancient times, survival often rested not on great inventions, but on small, steady improvements. Simple tools shaped by careful hands. Clever ideas passed down from one generation to the next. In the world of farming, even the smallest advance could make the difference between hunger and plenty. At the very beginning, there was only the digging stick. A straight branch, sharpened at one end. With it, the earliest farmers poked holes into the soil to drop in their seeds. Slow. Backbreaking. But it worked. For a time. As fields grew larger, so too did the need for better tools. The hoe arrived next. A flat blade fixed to a handle. Made first from stone, later from copper, bronze, and eventually iron. With the hoe, farmers could break up clumps of earth, pull weeds, and loosen soil for planting. Its design changed little for thousands of years. Then came the plow. One of humanity's most important inventions. Early plows, called ards, were little more than pointed sticks dragged through the soil. They scratched shallow, froze where seeds could be dropped. In the dry soils of Mesopotamia and Egypt, this was often enough. But in wetter, heavier soils, these simple plows struggled. They clogged easily. The invention of the moldboard plow was a quiet revolution. Its curved wooden or metal blade turned the soil over completely, burying weeds and mixing in nutrients. Fields could be prepared faster. Crops grew better. At first, plows were pulled by people. Strong men and women dragged the heavy beams through the earth, step by painful step. But as domesticated animals entered the scene, farming changed again. Oxen, donkeys, horses, all became vital partners in the fields. Harnessed to plows, they made cultivation faster, deeper, and far less exhausting for the farmer. The harness itself became an innovation. Early harnesses placed strain on the animal's throat, limiting its strength. But the invention of the yoke and, later, the padded horse collar allowed animals to pull with their full power without injury. A simple adjustment that unlocked vast new possibilities for farming. Planting was another task that saw small but meaningful changes. The seed drill, used in some ancient cultures, allowed seeds to be placed more evenly and at the right depth. This reduced waste and improved yields. In most places, however, broadcasting, simply tossing seeds by hand, remained common for centuries. Irrigation brought water to where it was needed most. The shadif, a long pole with a bucket and counterweight, lifted water from rivers and canals. Simple, but effective. Later, devices like the Archimedes screw and complex canal systems spread water across larger fields, extending farmland into drier regions. Harvesting, too, required its own set of tools. The sickle, its curved blade perfect for slicing through stalks of wheat and barley, became a farmer's constant companion. Crafted first from stone, then bronze, and finally iron, sickles made harvesting faster and more efficient. After harvest came threshing, separating the valuable grains from their tough husks. At first, farmers beat the stalks with sticks or flails. Later, they used animals to trample grain, laid out on hard threshing floors. Innovations like the threshing sledge, with embedded flint or metal teeth, helped speed the process further. Winnowing followed. Tossing the grain into the air allowed the wind to carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier kernels to fall back down. Simple baskets or wooden forks were all that was needed. Even storage methods improved slowly over time. Raised granaries protected grain from moisture and pests. Sealed clay jars kept supplies safe from spoilage. Innovations were often modest, but each added a layer of security to the farmer's fragile existence. The wheel played its part too. Carts drawn by oxen or donkeys transported heavy loads of grain, manure, or firewood. What once took many trips could now be done more quickly and easily. Paths turned into roads. Trade expanded. Surpluses could reach distant markets. In ancient Rome, large estates, latifundia, used slave labor and advanced farming techniques to produce enormous harvests. Crop rotation, fertilization with animal manure, and systematic planting schedules allowed these estates to dominate food production. In medieval Europe, the heavy plow, equipped with iron tips and a deep cutting blade, opened up the rich soils of northern lands that had been too dense for earlier tools. Three-field rotation, where one field rested while the others grew different crops, maintained soil fertility over time. Each advance may have seemed small at first. A better harness, a sharper blade, a more efficient plow. But added together, they transformed farming slowly, steadily, across the centuries. Yet even with these tools, ancient farming remained laborious. Each day began before sunrise and ended at sunset. The rhythm of planting, tending, harvesting, and storing was endless. The tools helped, but they never removed the hardship entirely. Farming innovations spread slowly. A new technique might remain unknown just a few valleys away. Travel was difficult. Communication was limited. Much of farming knowledge was passed down through families by word of mouth. Occasionally, traveling merchants, soldiers, or scholars would carry new ideas across regions. An improved plow design. A new method for storing grain. A clever irrigation trick. Slowly, the best ideas spread and took root in new soils. In the end, ancient farming was never about grand leaps forward. It was about persistence. About small victories earned by patient hands. And above all, about hope. Hope that the next season would be just a little easier than the last. And so, as the farmer sharpened his sickle beneath the morning sky, or adjusted the worn yoke across the oak's broad shoulders, he carried with him the quiet legacy of countless generations before him. Generations who had shaped, bit by bit, the ancient gamble with nature. In the ancient world, survival was a fragile balancing act. Even in good years, danger was never far away. A single bad harvest could lead to hunger. A spreading sickness could decimate a village. And often, these threats arrived together, each one feeding the other. Disease and famine were constant shadows. They walked silently beside every farmer, every family, every community. Sometimes for years. Sometimes for generations. Hunger weakened the body. And weakness invited illness. Malnutrition left people vulnerable to infections. Their immune systems grew frail. Wounds healed slowly. Even minor sicknesses became deadly. Diseases, too, arrived in many forms. Some were ancient and familiar: malaria, dysentery, smallpox, and tuberculosis. Others were sudden and terrifying, plagues that swept across entire regions. In warm, wet areas, mosquitoes carried malaria from one person to the next. The fever came in waves. Chills shook the body. Weakness settled in the bones. Many never recovered. Others lived with it for years, drained and exhausted. Contaminated water brought dysentery and cholera. These diseases spread easily where sanitation was poor. Diarrhea and dehydration could kill quickly, especially among children and the elderly. Smallpox scarred faces and claimed lives. Its pustules covered skin, spreading pain and fever. Survivors were often left disfigured. The disease traveled along trade routes, appearing suddenly and without warning. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was often called, ate away at lungs slowly. A deep cough. Blood in the sputum. Gradual wasting. There was no cure. only waiting. Crowded cities and poor hygiene allowed these diseases to flourish. Waste-filled streets. Rats and fleas carried other illnesses. The connection between cleanliness and health was poorly understood. And so, disease remained a constant visitor. When harvests failed, famine followed. Crops wilted beneath dry skies. Floods drowned fields. Pests devoured what little remained. Grain stores emptied. Stomachs shrank. Bones grew sharp beneath the skin. During famines, people often ate whatever they could find. Roots, leaves, bark, even dirt and clay in desperate cases. But such measures rarely provided enough nourishment. As bodies weakened, society broke down. Crime increased. The strong took from the weak. Families abandoned homes in search of food, often finding none. Entire villages emptied. Some famines were short-lived. A single season of poor weather. A failed harvest. With luck, trade or reserves might carry people through. But others dragged on for years. These were the true killers. When both disease and famine struck together, the toll was devastating. Starving people grew sick easily. Sick people could not work the fields. Crops went untended. Harvests failed further. A terrible cycle that fed on itself. Ancient records tell of these dark times. In Egypt, inscriptions describe famines lasting 7 years or more. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets record pleas for food and grain prices rising beyond reach. In China, chronicles speak of great droughts, floods, and hunger that left millions dead. Religious explanations were common. Many believed famine and disease were punishments from the gods. Offerings increased. Sacrifices were made. But still, the rains did not come. And the sickness did not leave. Some rulers tried to help. They opened granaries. Organized food distributions. Waived taxes. But often, their efforts were not enough. The scale of suffering overwhelmed any relief. In many places, social order collapsed entirely. Rebellions erupted. Kingdoms fell. Entire empires crumbled beneath the weight of hunger and death. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 in medieval Europe remains one of history's most chilling examples. Endless rains drowned crops for years. Livestock starved. People turned to eating dogs, horses, and even corpses. Disease followed close behind. The population of Europe shrank dramatically. And yet, somehow, people endured. When the rain stopped, when the crops grew again, life slowly returned to the fields. Families rebuilt. New children were born. The cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting resumed. These moments of survival were fragile victories. The line between life and death remained razor thin. Always one bad season away. Always one new sickness from disaster. For the ancient farmer, the struggle was never fully won. But still, year after year, they rose before the sun. They worked the soil. They planted seeds with hope, not certainty. And in that simple act, planting in the face of uncertainty, they quietly defied the great forces that sought to undo them. Nature's gamble continued. And so did they. And so, beneath ancient suns and shifting skies, farmers labored quietly against the odds. Through droughts and floods, sickness and hunger, they carried the weight of survival with steady hands. In their simple fields, they planted not just crops, but hope itself.